things reached a kind of tipping point, I suppose. See, the other thing about the politics of this country is bear in mind that after 1979, we had Margaret Thatcher and the Tories in power, and that became a kind of ice age. In the rest of Europe particularly, things were moving along, but in this country they weren't. That did mean, however, that kind of attitudes were changing through all those years, slowly. I remember in 1988, somebody was doing some kind of study, and they wanted to look at all of the printed media and do a blanket coverage over a period of what its coverage of LGBT stuff was. So I volunteered as part of this, and that really brought home about kind of how little information there still was. We're now talking the end of the 1980s. That it was all right for me because reasonably sort of well educated, living in a city, in touch with gay movement organisations, active trade unionist. Yeah, my life had moved along. But I think, if in those days, I lived in Glasgow in those days, if you were a working class teenager growing up in Easterhouse, and thinking, perhaps you're gay, and I wonder what that is, and say going to the library to see what you would find, you would still have found nothing. And that was no different at the end of the 1980s than it was 25 years earlier when I was doing that as a teenager. That hadn't changed by that point. Now those changes, see, one of the impacts of AIDS was, you had to start speaking openly about gay men having sex, and you had to get some information out into the public domain about that. That was a positive thing that followed on from AIDS, and just opened up a whole areas of public discussion. The other thing that AIDS did was kind of reunify, although it was a terribly frightening period, it reunified the gay movement, particularly brought women and men back together, because they had just split, men and women had just split apart big time around the end of the 1970s. But that came together. Then when Thatcher brought in Section 28, where was that? That was about 1988, wasn't it? That brought people together, and we then had a kind of a gay movement that was active and was oppositional in a way that we hadn't had from the Gay Liberation Front at the beginning of the 70s. And that, I think, that impacted more widely across society. People who were against Thatcher lined up with that. Things really only started to change after Labour came into power in 1997, but it then didn't change quickly. Blair was incredibly slow and incredibly cautious, and so it was really only well into after the year 2000. So year 2000, they equalised the age of consent, and that was, I think, a key piece of legislation, because as long as you had a different age of consent, there were all sorts of messages about that, carried all sorts of messages about all sorts of things. And I think from there on, things kind of move, from there on, I mean, our gains essentially have been banked. They won't take it away from us. Anything up till about the year 2000, they could, in theory, I think, have rolled it all back to where we were to start with. They can't take it away from us now.